I just finished a big cabinet for my kitchen. It took me 6 weeks, which I know, that's kind of ridiculous. But my wife and daughter are home full-time these days, and that means shop time is not what it used to be. But I made a video every week during the build, so there's like 6 videos, and there's a playlist, you should totally watch them. They're really interesting, but the problem is, when you break the project up into such little chunks, you're focusing on the details. There isn't enough big picture. And I was watching those videos and thinking, if somebody wanted to design and build a big piece like this, they wouldn't really be able to do it from watching these tiny little chunks of the project. So, how do you design and build a big, ambitious piece for your house? Well, you ask a series of simple questions, and the answers to those questions tell you how to build your piece. Ready? Let's go. Let's start simple. What is this thing going to look like? Now, personally, I rarely like to design a piece of furniture just purely out of my imagination. I like to look at traditional pieces of furniture instead. I figure if something's been made over and over again for decades, then it's probably a good design. I start with one of those traditional forms and then modify it as necessary. For this sort of work, I go straight to Pinterest. Searching around for cupboards, I found an old form called a dry sink that would have been used for storage and food preparation back before running water. I like this design because it has a lot of storage, and it looks simple but also nice. It's going to fit in my house. Pinterest makes it easy to throw together a collection of these pieces, and then later I can pull out the design elements that I like. Then I move over to SketchUp, where I can make a measured drawing, figure out how much stock I need, and get the overall look of the piece. Of course, to design it, you need to know how big it's going to be. Obviously, you can design something to any size you want, but I really like to look at off-the-shelf stock sizes that I can buy and try to design around those where I can. I'm using this quarter sheet of 1/2-inch plywood as the back of my cupboard. This means I don't need to build the back out of solid wood, and it's never going to shrink or swell. This piece also gives me my overall dimensions, 2 feet high by 4 feet wide. That'll fit the space where the cupboard is going, so I don't need to cut my plywood at all. For the sides of the case, I just chose from the different sizes of pine board I can buy at the big box store. For this project, 10-inch boards are perfect, and I'm going to save a lot of time by not having to rip anything. I often do my projects this way. I look at the stock that's available and see how I can design my piece for the minimum amount of work. Efficiencies like this matter a lot when you're working by hand. Last big question. How am I going to do the joinery for this project? I mean, obviously dovetails would be the strongest, but also the most time-consuming, and probably overkill for a simple kitchen cupboard. Instead, I think we're going to go with the basic rabbet joint. Since these are cross-grain rabbets, they're a little bit trickier to cut. I built a quick jig, and it guides my saw and chisel as I take out most of the waste. Then I can follow up with my simple, homemade rabbet plane to tune up the joint. The rabbet joint is also going to let me fit my plywood back. I can run a rabbet along the back edge of my pieces, and my plywood will drop right in. My shelves are all going into dados. This is the traditional joint for shelving in a cabinet, and it's not difficult to cut. Even if you're new at this kind of work, you should find it straightforward to saw the walls and chisel out the waste. This kind of joint is much easier if you have some kind of router plane, but I've got one you can build out of scraps. All you need is a chisel. After cutting these fairly basic joints, you can see the whole thing already coming together. Those rabbets are going to lock together nicely at the corners, and my plywood back drops right in. Here's another good question. What's going to happen if somebody just sits down right in the middle of this cabinet? And, it's going in a kitchen, so that might happen. And it's made of 4-foot-long pine boards. So if somebody sits in the middle of it, I think it's going to, collapse. So now's a good time to cut a couple of shallow dados into that middle shelf and fit a couple of dividers. This will give the cupboard 2 internal sections. And if anyone sits on the top, those dividers will transfer their weight straight to the floor. With the basic structure done, we're ready to assemble. And you might think that a big cabinetry job like this demands big clamps. But in fact, you don't need any long clamps to build this cabinet. Once we're ready for assembly, we can apply glue to our joints and then just nail the whole thing together. This kind of construction is both historically accurate and surprisingly strong. Nails and glue together make durable furniture, especially since the nails add a bit of flexibility. By nailing it together, you can avoid clamps and you can handle the assembly by yourself. You don't need to glue all the joints at once, so there's no need to rush. As soon as you have it nailed together, you can stand the whole thing up and add any little details to the case. The completed cabinet is square and sturdy, but it doesn't look like much. Luckily, we can dress it up a lot just by adding a face frame. This is a simple framework of 2-inch boards, joined at the corners and tacked on to the front of the case. It's easy to lay your stock right down on your piece, get a sense of the finished look, and mark your dimensions. For the corners, I'm taking just a little extra time to cut this notched half-lap joint. It's a tiny bit more complicated than your standard half-lap, but it's much stronger, and all the joinery and end grain will be hidden, giving the finished piece a much cleaner look. When the frame is totally cut and joined, I just clear off my bench and do the glue up right there. This is my traditional joiner's bench, and I built it small because I know a lot of my viewers have small workspaces. But even this 5-foot-long bench is plenty big enough to glue up this frame. I'm using clamps in this shot just to demonstrate how they work on a bench with big aprons, but you could just as easily nail this frame together with short tacks. That would work fine. The completed frame lays right on top of the case, and I've made the whole face frame bigger than the cabinet, by about 1/8 of an inch all around. This means my face frame will fit even if the cabinet isn't perfectly square, and I can trim it down later. I put a little glue on the edges of the case, and then just tack on the face frame. Adding this simple face frame turned my basic box into something that almost looks like furniture. Now this project is really starting to come together, but it's still kind of just a big box. It really needs doors. And doors can be a problem. They can be very labor intensive, especially if you're building with solid wood and you need to allow for wood movement. Luckily, tons of early American furniture pieces had simple, sturdy, attractive doors. We're going to copy some of those and get them knocked out fast. We're going to make our doors in a board and batten style. We'll start by cutting our boards a bit oversized for the openings in the case. It's always good when you can trim things to fit later. We can joint the boards for each door at the same time. This gives us a larger planing surface and tends to cancel out errors. So when I put the two boards together, I'm almost guaranteed a good joint. Once the boards are jointed, I can glue them up with either one clamp or no clamps at all. I can screw a couple battens down to the bench and then use little hardwood wedges to give all the clamping pressure I could want. You could check out my door making video for the details on both these techniques. While the glue is drying, I can make my battens. They're just narrow boards that get beveled all around, and then I screw them to the inside of my doors. It's important not to use any glue with these battens. The wood is going to need to move with the seasons, and the screws will allow just enough flex. Then the doors can be fitted, and they can be hung. At this point, our cabinet is more than just a box. It's a legitimate piece of furniture. I could stop right here, blow a coat of polyurethane over the whole thing, and call it done. But I've got to stop and think, how's that going to look actually in my house, and what kind of statement is that going to make about my craftsmanship? Personally, I need to take this thing just a little bit further. You might think a big rectangular piece like this is always going to look blocky and plain, but you'd be amazed at what you can do with some simple moldings. Now, before you break out the router or go looking for vintage molding planes, let me show you how you can make several lovely profiles just using the basic Woodwork for Humans toolkit. Here, I'm making a traditional shape called a thumbnail molding. It starts with a shallow rabbet across the edge of the board. After the rabbet, you need to round over that outside corner. I'm starting with a scrub plane here because it wastes away material so quickly. Then I'll switch over to a smoothing plane to refine that curve and get it looking really graceful. The completed molding can be cut on my DIY miter box, and those miters can be tuned up on this simple miter shooting board. Even working with basic hand tools and homemade jigs, there's no reason you can't get a perfect, seamless fit with your trim and moldings. For the bottom of the case, I'm going to do a simple stair-step molding. It's just a series of 3 little rabbets shot along the edge of a board. This soft white pine leaves some fuzzy corners, but if I just come in with a bit of sandpaper wrapped around a card, it's easy to take off those fibers and end up with a clean and crisp looking molding. I'm only showing 2 moldings in this video, but I actually experimented with 7 different shapes that you can cut with basic tools. Go back and check out that video, and you can see how I made them all. Last question. How is this piece going to look in its new home? It's going in my kitchen, and I have to think, how would this bright white pine look with just a clear coat over it? How would that fit into the room? Honestly, it would look terrible. This project needs paint. I know that furniture makers have been making their own paint for centuries, so I went deep on this detail. I tried several different recipes where I mixed powdered pigment with oils and thinners, and tried different ratios of this to that, and painted about a dozen test boards. I even did some entirely disgusting research on paint made from curdled milk. Finally, I decided that making your own paint is way more trouble than it's worth, especially since several companies sell inexpensive, pre-mixed traditional paints that you just mix with water and paint on. This is truly the best of both worlds. You get something more distinctive than plain old latex paint from the hardware store, but you don't have to spend days mixing and measuring to figure out what's actually going to work. These powdered milk paints are water-based, they have no VOCs, and they don't really smell like anything. So you can do your finishing inside, and the paint dries really fast. I will link to the paint I used, along with all the other tools and materials from this build, down in the description. Now, these traditional paints are a little bit flatter and a little more fragile than modern paints, but that's an easy fix. I just top coated the whole thing with 2 coats of shellac. That stuff gives great durability and a nice low luster, and each coat dries in just 10 minutes. The final cabinet looks nice down in the shop, but it looks even better in its new home in the kitchen. It fits with the rest of the room and it holds a lot of stuff. Everyone's happy. Projects like this can seem daunting because they're big and kind of complicated, but they're really not bad if you just break them down into smaller components. For one thing, spend a good amount of time designing your project. You want to think about not just how big is it going to be and where is it going to go, but how can you maximize your build time by using off-the-shelf components? Like when I made the back of my cabinet out of that quarter sheet of plywood. That was easy and it saved me a lot of time. Now, it's important to have plans, but you also have to be flexible with those plans. I was. Let's go back and take a look at my original digital sketch. Doesn't look exactly like the finished product, does it? Well, while I was building, I decided that that open bottom was just an invitation for dust and crap to get stuck under the cupboard. It's cleaner and neater to just close it up. And those paneled doors look nice in the sketch, but they're much more complicated to build, so I went with something a lot simpler. And in the end, I also did a lot more work with trim and moldings, just to make the whole thing prettier. I hadn't planned on doing any of this stuff when I first started the build and shooting the videos, but as I was working, I just realized I could do more, and I incorporated those new ideas into the work. And I suggest you do that too. Make plans, but don't be a slave to them. Oh, and speaking of plans, you might want to make a cupboard like this for your kitchen, and I have a spectacular set of plans. They're really detailed, easy to follow, and always super affordable. You can get those by clicking on the link down in the description or going to rexkruger.com/store. Now, if you're just getting into cabinetry work, you also might want some specialty planes for cutting those rabbets and dados that are essential to this kind of stuff. Now, I have these inexpensive planes you can make in your own shop. All you need are wood scraps and chisels. You also might need a workbench, and I have a cheap, easy to make bench. It's the joiner's bench. Doesn't cost a lot or take a lot of time, but it is rock solid. I've got plans for my specialty planes and for my joiner's bench, and you can get those by clicking the link down in the description. And speaking of plans, you know who already has all of these plans? My patrons on Patreon, because they get all of my plans for free, all the time. They also get early access to all of my videos, sneak peeks, behind-the-scenes content, a discussion board, and a bunch of other stuff. If you're interested in getting those rewards and being part of an amazing community, go on over to patreon.com/rexkruger and check out the rewards I have for the people who make this content possible. And listen, I'm going to be back next week with something awesome. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm already looking forward to it. I hope you'll be there. Thanks for watching.